Who is that girl you were with at the hotel? I'm done with this marriage and I'm filing a divorce.
I do not know what you're saying.
Today is the day I'll finally be free from you. Make sure you sign the divorce papers.
Unaware she just inherited a $60 billion music industry from her trillionaire dad, her husband left her for his childhood crush. On a Tuesday morning in September, Victoria Hayes sat in her penthouse office overlooking the Los Angeles skyline and made a decision that would change everything. She was holding a folder containing three things: a signed divorce agreement, proof that her husband Richard had been having an affair with his longtime crush named Sienna for the past 2 years, and a complete list of every major business deal they had built together over the past decade. She looked at the folder for a very long time. Then she made a phone call to her father's lawyer. Before we get into this story, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and let me know if you're watching from the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom. We read every single comment and we'd love to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button because what you're about to hear is a story about a woman who was underestimated, used, and then cast aside by the man she built an empire for. But what happened next is a masterclass in using knowledge as power and refusing to accept being invisible. Now let's get into this. Victoria Hayes grew up in New York City in a penthouse on the Upper West Side. Her father, Thomas Hayes, was a legendary figure in the music industry. He had built his empire in the 1980s and 1990s when the music business was booming. He owned record labels. He owned distribution rights to thousands of songs. He owned concert venues in major cities across America. He was worth approximately $60 billion. He was the kind of wealthy where money was no longer a concept, it was simply a reality that surrounded you like air. Victoria was an only child. Her mother had left when Victoria was 3 years old, unable to handle the demands of being married to a man who was married to his business. Thomas raised Victoria alone with the help of staff and nannies, but he also made sure she understood the business. From the time she was 14 years old, she spent summers in his office learning how the music industry worked. She learned about contracts. She learned about royalties. She learned about artist development. She learned about the power of relationships and how the entire industry was built on knowing the right people and being able to leverage those relationships into deals. By the time Victoria was in college at USC, studying business administration, she wasn't just learning theory. She was learning practice. Her father would have her sit in on meetings. He would have her analyze contracts. He would have her evaluate potential deals. Thomas believed that Victoria should inherit not just his wealth but his knowledge. He believed that the money would mean nothing without the understanding of how to maintain it. Victoria was brilliant. Her professors said so. Her father's business partners said so. Investors who met her said so. She had a mind for numbers, but more importantly, she had intuition about people. She could look at someone and understand what motivated them. She could understand what they needed from a deal and what they were willing to sacrifice to get it. She could negotiate in a way that left everyone feeling like they had won, even when she had actually gotten exactly what she wanted. After college, Victoria went to work for her father's company. She started in artist development, finding new talent and helping develop their sound and their image. But she quickly moved into the business side. She began handling contracts. She began meeting with investors. She began building relationships with the major players in the industry. By the time she was 25 years old, she was her father's right hand. She was the person who knew the details of every major deal. She was the person who understood the long-term strategy. She was the person who could walk into a room with a struggling artist and a skeptical investor and come out with a contract that made both parties happy. And then she met Richard Ashton. Richard was 30 years old when he came into their office in 2015. He had been working in music promotion for a small independent label. He had big dreams of starting his own label, his own empire. But he had no capital. He had no connections. He had no track record of major success. What he had was charisma. He had charm. He had the kind of confidence that made people want to believe in him. Victoria's father was not interested in Richard. Thomas Hayes had heard 1,000 pitches from 1,000 hungry entrepreneurs. Most of them went nowhere. But Victoria saw something in Richard. She saw someone who was hungry enough to do the work. She saw someone who was willing to learn. She saw someone who had the right instincts about music, even if he didn't have the experience. She convinced her father to give Richard a chance. Not as a full partner, but as someone they would back. Someone they would mentor. Someone they would introduce to their network. Victoria took Richard under her wing. For the first year, Richard and Victoria worked closely together. She introduced him to artists. She helped him understand contracts. She showed him how to evaluate talent. She taught him how to negotiate with producers and studios. She taught him how to pitch deals to investors. She taught him everything she knew. And Richard was an excellent student. He learned quickly. He understood the nuances of the business. He had instincts that were good. And somewhere in the process of working together, Richard fell in love with Victoria. Or thought he did. Or at least, he became very good at making Victoria believe he had fallen in love with her. He asked her to dinner. He asked her to be his girlfriend. He asked her to marry him. Victoria, who had spent her entire life focused on business and learning, had never had time for serious relationships. She said yes to all of it. She married Richard in 2016, 1 year after he came into her father's office. From the outside, it looked like the perfect marriage. Victoria was brilliant and beautiful and wealthy. Richard was charming and ambitious and good-looking. They were the power couple of the Los Angeles music scene. They were photographed at industry events. They were invited to the right parties. They were featured in business magazines as an example of how to build a modern empire. But the empire was Victoria's. Richard was the face of it. Victoria was the brain behind it. She introduced Richard to every major investor in the industry. She helped him secure capital for his label. She connected him with artist-producers who had worked with her father for decades. She used her knowledge of what had worked in the past to shape Richard's strategy for the future. She negotiated deals. She evaluated artists. She made the decisions that turned Richard's small startup label into a major force in the music industry. By 2018, Richard's label had signed 5 major artists. By 2020, his label had released 20 albums that went platinum or gold. By 2022, Richard Ashton was considered one of the most successful music executives of his generation. He was being written about in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He was being invited to speak at conferences. He was being courted by other companies who wanted to buy his label or merge with him. Victoria knew that none of it would have happened without her. She knew that every successful deal could be traced back to a conversation she had had, a connection she had made, a piece of advice she had given. She knew that Richard's empire was actually her empire, built with her knowledge and her relationships and her strategic thinking. But Richard was beginning to forget. Or perhaps he was beginning to rewrite the history in his mind. In interviews, when asked how he had built such a successful label, he talked about his vision. He talked about his instincts. He talked about taking risks. He mentioned Victoria occasionally, calling her his wife and his partner, but the way he said it made it sound like she was a support person, not the architect. Victoria tried not to let it bother her. She told herself that it didn't matter who got credit as long as the business was successful. But it did bother her. It bothered her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. In 2020, Richard attended an industry conference in Miami. The conference lasted 3 days. While he was there, he reconnected with Sienna Montgomery, a woman he had known in college. Sienna was intelligent and beautiful and successful in her own right. She was a music producer and had worked with some of the biggest artists in the world. Richard and Sienna had dated in college, before Richard met Victoria. Richard had always said that Sienna was his greatest regret, the one that got away. Sienna was at the conference. They had drinks. They had dinner. They had a conversation that went on until 3 in the morning. According to what Richard would later tell people, it was during that conversation that he realized he had married the wrong woman. What happened after that was a slow unfolding of infidelity. Richard began taking trips to Miami on business. He would be gone for 3 or 4 days at a time. Victoria didn't know where he was going or who he was seeing, but she knew something had changed. His texts became less frequent. His attention was divided. When he came home, he seemed distant. He would spend long hours on his phone. He would take calls in his study with the door closed. Victoria is intelligent. She is observant. It didn't take her long to figure out that Richard was having an affair. She had a private investigator follow him. The investigator brought back photographs and credit card statements and hotel records. All of it confirmed what Victoria had suspected. Richard was having an affair with Sienna Montgomery. But Victoria didn't confront him immediately. She did something else first. She began quietly preparing for what she knew was coming. She made copies of every contract that Richard's label had ever signed. She made lists of every investor they had worked with. She made notes of every conversation she remembered having that had led to a major deal. She organized all of this information methodically and carefully. She also did something else. She reached out to her father. Thomas Hayes was 68 years old in 2022. He was not in good health. His doctors had told him that he had maybe 5 years left. Victoria had a long conversation with her father about her marriage, about Richard, about the future. She told him everything. She told him about the affair. She told him about her fears. She told him what she was planning to do. Thomas listened to everything his daughter had to say. And then he made a decision. He changed his will. He left his entire $60 billion empire to Victoria. Not in a way that was meant to be revealed after his death. But in a way that was meant to give Victoria power right now, in this moment, while he was still alive. He also did something else. He transferred controlling interest of his company to Victoria. He made her the official majority shareholder. He gave her the power to make decisions about the company. He made her officially equal to him in the eyes of the business world, even though everyone in the industry already knew that she was the one who understood the business better. 3 weeks later, Richard came home and told Victoria that he wanted a divorce. He said it very calmly. He said that he had made a mistake marrying her. He said that he realized now that Sienna was the woman he should have married all along. He said that he was in love with Sienna and that he wanted to spend his life with her. Victoria listened to him. And then she said something that changed everything. She said, "I know about Sienna. I have known for 6 months. I have photographs and credit card statements and hotel records. I have everything documented. And I have been waiting for you to tell me the truth." Richard's face went very pale. He realized in that moment that Victoria knew everything. He realized that she had been preparing for this conversation. What he didn't understand yet was how thoroughly she had been preparing. Victoria told Richard that yes, she would give him a divorce. But there were going to be conditions. She told him that she was going to keep the house in Los Angeles. She was going to keep the penthouse in New York. She was going to keep the condo in Miami. She was going to keep 90% of their liquid assets. And she was going to keep control of every business relationship that he had built during their marriage. Richard laughed. He actually laughed. He told Victoria that she couldn't do any of those things because the label was his company. The deals were his deals. The relationships were his relationships. He said that Victoria had just been the person who helped him manage things, but he was the one who had built the empire. Victoria smiled. And then she explained something to Richard very carefully. She explained that she had documentation of every deal they had ever made together. She had the contracts. She had the emails. She had the notes from meetings. She had the bank records showing that her father had provided the initial capital. She had everything that proved that the label was built using her father's money and her connections and her strategy. But more importantly, she told Richard something else. She told him that she had already begun contacting every major investor and business partner they had worked with over the years. She had showed them all of the documentation. She had told them the story of how she had built the empire and how Richard had benefited from her work. She had told them about Richard's infidelity. She had told them about his plan to take credit for work he had not done and to cut out the woman who had made his success possible. And, Victoria said to Richard, she had offered them a choice. They could continue working with Richard's label, knowing what kind of man he was and knowing that he would likely try to push them out once he no longer needed them. Or they could come work directly with her and her father's company, bringing all of their artists and all of their deals with them. Most of them chose Victoria. Richard sat down. He understood in that moment that Victoria had systematically destroyed everything he had built. More accurately, she had taken back everything that had always been hers. Over the next 6 months, Victoria executed a plan of surgical precision. She contacted every single major artist that Richard's label represented. She reminded them of her involvement in their careers. She showed them contracts and emails that proved her role in their success. She offered them better deals if they moved to her father's label. 17 out of 20 artists chose to move. She contacted every investor. She showed them the documentation. She explained to them that Richard was planning to cut them out and take all of the credit and all of the profits. She offered them better terms and more transparency if they moved their money to her father's company. 14 out of 18 investors chose to move their capital. She contacted every producer and studio that had worked with Richard's label. She reminded them of her father's long history in the industry. She reminded them of the relationships she had built. She offered them work with her father's company. Almost all of them agreed. Within 6 months, Richard's label had lost almost everything. His artists had left. His investors had pulled their money. His producers were working with other companies. He was left with a company that had no revenue and no prospects. Richard tried to fight back. He hired lawyers. He tried to claim that the label was his company and that Victoria had no right to interfere with it. But the lawyers quickly told him that he had no case. Everything had been done legally. Everything had been done properly. Victoria had used only the truth and documentation to convince people to move their business. The divorce was finalized in 2023. Victoria kept everything. Richard left with his clothes and his car and his broken heart over Sienna, who had left him the moment she realized he was going to be broke. But that's not the end of Victoria's story. That's just the end of the Richard part. During this same time period, Victoria's father's health had gotten worse. In late 2023, Thomas Hayes died. He was 69 years old. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people from the music industry. People who had worked with him for decades. People who he had helped and mentored. People who owed their careers to him. Victoria inherited his entire $60 billion empire. But she didn't just inherit it. She had been running it for the past year while her father was sick. She knew where everything was. She understood every detail of every deal. She understood the strategy. She understood the vision. And she had a vision for what she wanted to do. Victoria decided that instead of just running her father's company, she wanted to use her power to change the music industry. She started a fund dedicated to helping young musicians and producers who came from underrepresented backgrounds get access to capital and mentorship. She started a legal fund to help musicians who have been taken advantage of by exploitative contracts understand their rights and get fair deals. She also did something else. She started her own label. Not using her father's company, but using her own name and her own vision. She called it Hayes Music, a tribute to her father. And she used everything she had learned from her decade with Richard to build something real and authentic and based on genuine relationships and real value. Within 2 years of her father's death, Hayes Music had signed 10 artists. Within 3 years, it had released 5 albums that went platinum. Within 4 years, Victoria was being written about in the same magazines that had written about Richard. But this time, the articles were about a woman who had built an empire from nothing. A woman who had vision and strategy and the intelligence to execute on that vision. Richard Ashton, meanwhile, tried to start over. He tried to convince Sienna to marry him, but Sienna wanted nothing to do with him once she realized he was broke. He tried to get another job in the music industry, but no one would hire him. Everyone knew what he had done. Everyone knew that he had tried to steal credit for work that wasn't his. Everyone knew that he had abandoned the woman who had made his success possible. He eventually left Los Angeles. He moved to Austin, Texas, where no one knew who he was. He got a job as a middle manager at a marketing firm. He made decent money, but nothing compared to what he had made when he was with Victoria. He got married to someone he met at work. They had 2 children. By all accounts, he lived a normal, ordinary life. The kind of life he would have had if Victoria had never taken him under her wing. But Victoria didn't think about Richard anymore. She thought about her vision for the future of music. She thought about the artists she wanted to help. She thought about the mentors she wanted to be to the next generation of music executives. In 2024, Victoria met a man named Marcus at a charity event for her foundation. Marcus was a documentary filmmaker who had made films about social justice issues. He was intelligent and kind and genuinely interested in Victoria's work. He didn't care about her wealth or her power. He cared about her vision and her values. They fell in love slowly and naturally. He appreciated her intelligence. He celebrated her success. He understood that she needed to be autonomous and in control of her own life. He didn't try to take credit for her work or to diminish her accomplishments. He simply supported her and believed in her. Victoria married Marcus in 2024. Their wedding was small and intimate, attended by people who genuinely cared about them. It was nothing like the splashy industry event that her wedding to Richard had been. And it was infinitely more meaningful. Today, Victoria Hayes is 37 years old. She runs her father's empire and her own label. She sits on the board of multiple companies in the music industry. She mentors young musicians and executives. She is using her power to change the industry from the inside. Richard Ashton is 45 years old. He manages marketing campaigns for a mid-sized company in Austin. He is married to a woman who has no idea that he was ever anything other than an ordinary marketing manager. He lives in a nice suburban home with his 2 children. He drives a reliable car. He has a good life, but it is a normal life. Victoria's story teaches us something important about power and credit and the way we value different kinds of work. It teaches us that the person who appears to be the face of success is not always the person who created that success. It teaches us that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be invisible. It teaches us that using the truth and documentation and the power of your relationships as weapons is sometimes the most ethical thing you can do. It teaches us that the woman who is taken for granted and underestimated is often the most dangerous person in the room, because she has nothing to lose and everything to prove. But most importantly, it teaches us that getting revenge is not the same as getting justice. Victoria didn't just destroy Richard's career because she wanted revenge. She destroyed his career because she wanted to reclaim what was hers. She wanted to take back the credit that had been stolen from her. She wanted to make sure that the next woman who worked alongside an ambitious man would not be erased the way she almost was. And having done that, Victoria was able to move forward. She was able to build something new and authentic. She was able to find genuine love with someone who respected her. She was able to use her power not to hurt others but to help others. That is the real power move. That is the real victory. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been taken for granted by someone you helped? Have you ever had your work stolen or your contributions erased? Have you ever had to choose between revenge and moving forward? Have you ever been so underestimated that you became more powerful than the person who underestimated you? We read every single comment and your story matters. Tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Canada, or the United Kingdom or Ireland or Jamaica? We would love to hear from you. Please hit that like button if Victoria's story resonated with you. If you believe in the power of women reclaiming their narrative and their value, please subscribe because next week we're telling the story of a woman who discovered that her business partner had been stealing from her for years, hiding money in offshore accounts while telling her the company was failing. What she discovered when she finally looked at the bank statements will shock you. You won't want to miss that. I'll see you there.